Hello, everybody. I was wondering if it was going to do that. Let me turn that off. Hi, I'm Chris Weave, and it is Saturday night at 9 o'clock, and this is Starfleet Tactical, episode, I think, 164. Oh, my God. This COVID temporary thing just won't go away, will it? This week I have with me Peter Gold, who's been on the show a couple of times. Peter is a merchant mariner who hasn't been on the show for a while because he's been overseas, but now he's back. Peter, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Catching up on stuff around the house. Pretty much set up on that. Get some repairs to make, but going good. So I'll be home for a few more months, and then it's back to overseas.
So many moons ago, I read John McPhee's Waiting for a Ship, which I believe the system doesn't quite work the way it used to, but in that it talked about how you'd go to sea for like 6 months and then you'd have multiple months off. And
yes, that's still true. If you can make your money last, and that the company that you work for, or the union, even though you always get the job technically through the union.
Okay.
For in the U.S., if either the union or the company doesn't need you back someplace else quicker.
Okay. So. Yeah, I know that when McPhee wrote that book, there was they had a surplus of mariners, and as a result, it was pretty much a reasonably strict 6 on 6 off cycle from what he was saying.
Or worse. I had a friend in that era, graduated 5-6 years ahead of me. He 18 months off.
Wow.
Yeah. He went to work for, I think, either IBM or Digital Equipment.
Yeah, I can see how that wouldn't work out for you very well.
Yeah.
He also talked about how everybody when they went to sea worked insane hours, including overtime, which, I went tilt when I heard that, because of course, all of my experience at sea was watching U.S. Navy guys do, and the U.S. Navy doesn't pay overtime. But he was talking about how basically everybody worked 16-hour days because they were working overtime to make as much money as they could while they were at sea. So then you'd go ashore and just sort of hang out for 6 months.
Yeah, they changed that. There was a few accidents where people said they were overtired, and they put in what they call hours of rest requirements. So okay. You can't work more than 15 hours out of a 24-hour day for 3 days. Otherwise, if it's, quote, an emergency, normally you can't work more than 12 hours a day.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
In the aviation community, they have crew rest requirements. And I know that the saying amongst naval aviators was, NATOP says you have to get 8 hours of sleep a day, and you get at night is extra.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The surface warfare guys and the submariners would look at this and go like, crew rest, what the hell is that? You guys are wimps.
Yeah, but I don't know about the sub guys. We don't hear much from them, but the surface warfare, their training has been lacking. They were actually talking about sending junior Navy officers, ensigns, right out of school onto merchant ships for a year.
I think that would be really good.
I think it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Because what I'm seeing as interesting would be, we have somebody right out of school or out of one of the academies who went merchant marine, didn't do the Navy thing, or only does it as a reservist.
Mm-hmm.
And their roommate from college went active duty in the Navy, and the first thing they do is get assigned to this. They just have to get assigned to the same ship with another ensign. Oh, you're here to learn how to become, get your 1 year of sea time so you can pass STCW type training. Well, the guy that graduated from one of the maritime academies that went in the Navy, he's already got the training. He's already got the license. And, here's his new ensign, say, right out of Annapolis going, why does he get to do this and I don't? Well, you didn't graduate from a maritime academy. You don't have a Coast Guard license.
Exactly. So,
yeah. Or you end up going, yeah, if you already got this, you get to go to a regular warship first, which puts all the Annapolis grads basically a year behind, which is not going to be allowed.
So, well, thank you very much for coming on the show. We're going to talk about merchant marine stuff. That's the topic of today's session, because there's been a huge change over the course of the last few years in terms of how the global economy works. And early on in the Starfleet tactical time period, we talked about the book The Box and about shipping containers and stuff like that. And we're watching that system fall apart in real time. And so, it's easy to say the system is falling apart. The system is really, really big and really, really resilient. And so it would be probably more accurate to say that it's evolving.
It's either evolving or the Bretton Woods world order is falling apart. Take your choice.
Yeah, I think you could say both are probably the case.
Yeah.
But so we'll do a little bit of housekeeping stuff, and then we'll seriously get into it. The first bit of housekeeping, let me go ahead and throw up the admin slide that we have to do each time. And so here's the admin slide. The only change there's two changes that's occurred, and that is next week is a definite no, because I'm going to be traveling next weekend. So it's a definite no. And then I also realized that I had left a week out. I had left the week after that, the 19th of April out. And I do plan on having a show the 19th of April. Then the 26th of April and the 3rd of May are definite no's. I'm going to be out of town, busy on Saturday night. And then after that, reply hazy, try again later. Magic 8 Ball can't give me an answer right now. And that's because I'm going to be moving. And I need to do things like talk to a realtor and buy a house and pack up and move and unpack and all the rest of it. And I have absolutely no idea what that looks like yet. Part of the 26 April to 3 May trip is going to be some house hunting. But I don't even at this point know whether I'm moving stuff into storage and going to go crash at a friend's house for 6 months. My old grad school roommate, I might crash at her place for 6 months. We were roommates for 2 years. We know what we're getting into. And so that might happen, or I may, immediately move into a place and it may be over before it started. So not sure yet exactly what's going to happen with all that. Going to figure that out. And then at some point in the future, there's a list of things that I want to talk about. That list hasn't changed. The only thing that happened is I deleted off merchant marine stuff because we're going to talk about that tonight. And that's it for slides. Let me go ahead and remove that. A couple of other things. One of the things on there is next week I'm hosting a conference called Connections Online. That's my other COVID project, was to run a professional wargaming conference. And Bob asked the question that he couldn't find my seminars for Connections Online 2025. What are the title of the sessions I'm in? I'm actually going to be I'm running 2 sessions, and I'm going to be part of a third one, basically. I am part of a session called Wargaming the Far Future. And then I am also moderating sessions called Using AI in War Games, and the other one is Wargaming AI. So those might sound similar. The one is AI is a tool that you can use to help put on war games. How do you use the tool of AI to help make your war games work? The second one, wargaming AI is something that is going to affect the battle space, and a war game has to be able to take AI into account. How do you go about taking AI into account in your war games? So if you do a search in tabletop events for those particular ones, those are the ones that you can that I'm going to be part of. Everything that happens in Connections Online eventually gets made public in YouTube. And so if you want to pay $5, it helps support StreamYard. It helps undercut the cost. You basically pay $5. You directly subsidize. Well, actually, you don't subsidize this show because we're using Alex's account for this show. But you subsidize my StreamYard account. But if you just wait a couple of weeks, it'll be available without charge on YouTube. So thank you, Lissa, for posting it in the chat. Let's see. Somebody else asked the question whether Star Trek has merchant marines. Actually, does Starfleet have merchant marines? Starfleet probably doesn't, but the Federation might.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've seen that. Well, Mudd and
we kind of have, but that was only during Enterprise era, and it was only a handful of people. That it was mostly actual merchants.
We saw merchants, but we didn't see a merchant marine. We didn't see, because the merchant marine is really kind of weird, right? It's not like having a civilian job in that, I mean, I'm just a civilian. I just go work for people, right? And so it's not like you just sort of apply to be a guy on a ship. There's a lot more stuff that has to go through that. You mentioned the union earlier. You mentioned the academies earlier, et cetera. So tell me about how the merchant, what is the merchant marine?
Okay, so the merchant marine technically is an industry. It's not an organization, although there is a part of the U.S. Code allowing for the United States Maritime Service.
Okay.
We haven't had that since the end of World War II. They're trying to bring it. There's been talk about trying to bring it back from the Union side, because getting our common access cards to be able to deal with the Navy computer systems has been a real pain. It's like, yeah, we need you on a ship in 2 days. Oh, you need a CAC to get onto the ship's computer. In the next appointment's not for 60 days.
Yeah.
No. So this would allow us to have our CACs through the Maritime Service, where we renew them every 3 to 5 years, or whatever the standard is for the Navy. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's expiring in 6 months. I just got off a ship. Let me go renew it, and I'm good for 3 more years. So you join the industry, say, just like you join the airline industry. Okay. We work for a company through a union, though. Once you get a little bit more senior, you tend to work for the same company. You still have to tell the union that you're going to a specific ship. And the union allows this because they want people to be able to stay on ships where they feel comfortable, they're good at that ship, that class. Training wise, when I started out, you had to be 16 years old and have a pulse. Okay, they've changed it since then.
And you passed that test.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Oh, and you had to not be addicted to drugs.
Okay.
They've changed things since. You have to take a 5-day course called Basic Safety Training. You learn how to use a lifeboat, use a life raft, demonstrate that you can swim in a survival suit, that you know how to use a life jacket, that you can fight a fire. You learn the social niceties of that you should take a shower every day. You should do your laundry every week. Okay. The set of topics was designed for people coming out of the backwoods of the third world.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an IMO international. This is basically UN, the International Maritime Organization, international requirement. And if you're from a first world country, most of this should be pretty obvious on the social side. There are people just like boot camp. When was the last time how often do you take a shower at home? Well, I'm in the wherever. We don't have hot and cold running water. So then in the United States, easiest way is to join a union, probably. The unlicensed union, Seafarers International, runs an apprenticeship program. It's 6 months long, I believe.
Okay.
You don't get paid for half of it because you're in school, shoreside school. They run you through a bunch of training. The half of the 6 month period when you're out at sea as an apprentice, you do get paid, as far as I know. Then you come out with some seniority in the union. The other way you do it, you call up some of the oil field companies and say, "Hey, I've got my merchant mariner's card. I'd like to get a job." And if they've got an opening, they'll hire you. You can also work foreign, like on a cruise ship.
Let's go back to oil field for a second. What do you do if you're working for an oil company?
You're usually working for an oil service company, oil field service company. You're not working for one of the big oil companies.
Oh, okay. So you're going to and from the platforms.
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly. Sometimes you're working on the platform itself. You're running the boats. You can start off as a deckhand working in the galley. I think they have cooks on board, but I'm not 100% sure. They're mostly relatively short runs for some of them. They used to be.
A lot of what you're describing sounds very much like what you see at the beginning of Nathan Lowell's Quarter Share.
Yes.
So it sounds like Nathan cribbed a lot from the real world.
Yes.
So for what it's worth, everybody, that series is fantastic. I jokingly say it's a series where nothing happens. But I'm only semi-joking because it really is kind of a series where it is a series about the life of a space-going merchant mariner and him working his way up from a guy who just kind of needed to find a job sooner rather than later because his life had gone to hell for not his fault. And how he made the best of a bad situation and how he became a professional in his field. And it's a fantastic people-oriented story. It is not the story you go if you want to, if it is not the pulse-pounding action kind of story. But I absolutely love those books. They're fantastic.
Yes.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, so all right, so it's an industry. There's some interesting things there about how you end up on a particular ship and how you end up sort of assigned to ships and stuff like that. It's one of the things that you sort of hinted at but didn't fully articulate is the fact that if you're for a lot of ships, you have multinational crews.
Yes, outside of the United States, you do.
And so, like, you could have, I mean, literally anybody from anywhere.
Yes, there are limitations. They did a study out of the Netherlands, and there's certain groups you cannot mix and match.
Because they don't get along?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, so like you can't take Northern European unlicensed and put them under like Indian officers.
Interesting.
Yes. Yes. So, I think that was one of the mixes, but it was one of these odd little things.
That isn't one that would immediately jump out at me.
Right, which is why when I went through the grid for the required management course, I kept the book, because it was like, this is odd that they would actually have studied this. So,
yeah, there's a couple of interesting YouTube channels of people that are merchant mariners. There's one that's Chief McCoy.
Yes. Yeah.
MAKOI for anybody who wants to look it up. And he is, what is
Filipino.
he? Filipino. That would have been my guess. And
Yeah.
and so he was doing a lot of stuff sort of like on a very consistent basis, and he sort of dropped off. I noticed, and just looking at it right now, it said, "What happened to Chief McCoy?" So apparently, I haven't looked at it that one yet. I need to take a look at it.
Yeah. He gets on different ships with different contracts because they work through a different crewing system. They don't necessarily work through a union; they work through a crewing company. They have individual contracts, and you are hitting up the limits of my knowledge on that, because that's not the
system you work under.
Right. The best I could do is say, watch his channel. He does talk about it.
The guy in the cubicle next to me in Newport, his brother was a merchant mariner. I guess probably still is, but he made the comment about how he had just gotten hired, and for that trip he was going to be the captain. He was going to be the master.
Yep.
And then, but that was what he was hired for that time. And so who knows who is going to be the captain next time.
Right. And
which is really kind of weird.
Yeah. If they need somebody, you can get promoted up to the level of your license. They'll usually, if you do good at the lower level, they'll bounce you up. And if you don't handle that very well, they'll bounce you back down one level. So it's not like the military or the U.S. Navy where it's, oh yeah, you didn't do good as a captain of a ship, so you're going to be out of the Navy at the end of your whatever.
Maybe tomorrow.
If you really screw up tomorrow, but otherwise, one of our friends made XO of a building, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to name names.
Yeah.
And all right, well, there goes his career track. Didn't make the cut because there's just not enough billets.
That happens.
In the Merchant Marine, he'd have stayed a department head forever, until a job happened to open up. So.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that sort of highlights the difference between the Merchant Marine and the Navy and Star Trek and everything else that we ever actually experienced, right? If you go onto an aircraft carrier and it's 5 years, right? You talk about the 5-year mission. You go into an aircraft carrier and it's 5 years later. Anybody who's on that carrier went off to do something else and has come back. And they just happened to be back on the same carrier. They didn't stick around because nobody has a 5-year assignment. And so you're constantly cycling people in and out, which means, it's not like a business or an agency where you've got some old timers that have been around for a while and you can say, hey, what happened with such and such? Oh yeah, I remember that. I was part of that. Instead, you've got all the files and you can go through the paperwork and read the records and read the old logs and stuff like that. But in terms of like asking who was here when that happened, the answer is nobody was here. Yeah. It's an entirely new crew.
Yeah. And with the computerization of records, the records have just gotten so voluminous that if you can't find it with a simple search,
you'll never find it.
Yeah. It's not like when I was at the academy, the senior engine cadet. He was the cadet chief engineer. But one of his duties was to make machinery history entries by hand in these notebooks. So anything major that was done for a major inspection, major incident, went onto a little card for that piece of equipment. And we had stuff going back to the 1960s. And, there's just weren't that many cards for any given piece of equipment. So he just happens, he's looking through, he had to do something with the forced draft fans, the heaters.
Okay.
And he's, cleaned them, or inspected or something. He's looking through there, there's 4 or 5 cards. 1962, fire. They burnt one up and had to have it repaired. Nowadays, there's just every little maintenance action's documented. You just can't. It's real hard to pull out, and this is a data systems problem, the quote important stuff versus, well, we just do this. We do this every 6 months. We do get a lot of turnover, but it's a toss-up as to whether who and how many people on a given ship are sticking around, or even within the same class.
Mm-hmm.
You've got people that worked on, they spent 10, 12 years working on 3 or 4 ships of the exact same type. And, they have to sometimes remember, oh yeah, no, on this ship, the valve is over here. On the other 2 ships, it's over here.
Yeah.
Okay. So they don't quite make them 100%. They're close usually.
So I spent some time on DDG 77 and DDG 78, right? Same flight of Arleigh Burke, flight 2s, made in different shipyards. The door to the Commodore's stateroom was on a different wall. I was constantly running into little things that were different. And that was one of them. In that the Commodore stateroom, there was a corridor that covered 2 sides of it. And on one ship, the door was on one wall, and on the other ship, the door was on the other wall. And there's other little changes here and there. One of the things that it's also I find interesting about things like this, and every time I went to sea and I'm encountering something like this, I'm literally thinking to myself, like, how would they handle this in Star Trek? The amount of time the amount of time I was standing on an aircraft carrier or a destroyer thinking about Star Trek is surprisingly high. One thing I heard when they were talking about doing rotational crews, they were going to do 3 crews for 2 ships, and they were just going to rotate them through. And one of the issues with that is not every ship handles the paperwork the same way, in that on this ship, this department handles job X, but on this other ship of the exact same class, another department handles job X. And why would you have it set up that way? Well, because 15 years ago, these guys were shorthanded. They were like down a chief, and they weren't going to get a replacement. And so the workload was too high. These guys had the capacity. So the chief engineer just said, okay, you guys do this instead of them, and take all the paperwork and move it over there. And so rather than slotting individuals into a crew and sort of like, doing the crew of Theseus thing, right? Instead, when you bring an entirely new group of people on board, they go into a space and they go, well, where's the records on Optifrats? All right, ask around, find who's got this. And that's the sort of thing. Is the Navy standardized? Yes, but that yes has a little asterisk next to it. And it's yes, but. Yes, but. And so it always makes me wonder how they would do that in Star Trek. And at some level, I kind of concluded that probably in Star Trek, the computer keeps track of all that. And you just say, hey, computer, who's got the records on such and such?
or just show me the records.
Yeah, or just show me the records or whatever. It doesn't matter in that regard.
I mean, we do billet level access on the ships. You come on, you sign, you get into the ship's set of databases, and we give you permission to do certain things within the database, partially based on your billet to start with. And as you start learning stuff and we learn that we can trust you to do things, we give you more access. So, junior people, yeah, they can look at an awful lot of stuff. They can't edit it. They can't add to it, but they can look at it. And then they have to, I enforce the thing, if you touch a part, I want the box, because there's only 2 people on the ship that can issue out parts, and I'm one of them. So, that's one of those key things. We keep the inventory up by every time you use something. I don't care where you got it. You bring me the box, and I'll find out where it came from, or where it's supposed to come from, and I'll verify it. Oh yeah, you found this. Yeah, you found this in Shadow Spares. It does, wherever you found it, it's not where you didn't get where it's supposed to be. So, or somebody forgot to take a report that they used something. That's how I find it. So,
I remember talking with you about some of the ships that you've been on and discovering, what was it that they were taking old parts, they were replacing parts and taking the old part and putting it back in the bin?
Yes.
So you were finding used parts. Yeah.
Basically use broken parts. It's one thing to put a part in that you use for testing and going, yeah, well, this wasn't the problem. Let's take, if it's not that hard, we'd take it back out, put it back in the bin, and put the original part in that was still good.
So I should emphasize that this was a case where Peter's company took over from another company. This was not people at Peter's company being slackers. It was some other company where they were slackers.
Yeah.
Stephen Ross says in the school board, we can't even standardize toilets, which is funny. Dustin basically describes a situation, I think it's sort of kind of what we're talking about, where the computer keeps track of the modifications made to the ships. And so the computer would have all the different specs for each individual ship. I kind of like that as an idea. And it also makes me wonder if you couldn't do something like that. Maybe that's one of the use cases for AI, is the ability to say, hey, Chat GPT or whatever it is, tell me what's important about this particular system. What are the big maintenance items on this system? Don't flood me with all the data. Tell me what the big picture story is.
Yeah, and we don't get the granularity at the moment for that.
That's the dirty little secret about all this AI stuff, is that it has exquisite data requirements. And that's the big problem we have with a lot of stuff, is if you're dealing with a large language model, you need large language data sets in order to make it work, and they have to be cleaned data sets. Otherwise, you're drinking your own bathwater, and that's not good.
Well, in this case, it would be, so I can't tell if I write up a work order, I can't tell easily, well, was this just to change out a bunch of light bulbs, because we have to document what we do this because this is one way we document our overtime and also document any parts we use? Or am I have a major breakage of a major piece of equipment, but they were able to fix it, so we don't have to go out to a contractor, and it's difficult. They've added a little bit of nuance to it, but we have 30 years of data, and nobody's going to go back through and retag everything.
Yeah, this is one of those things where we're going to have to say, okay, from this point on, the standard has changed, and 10 years from now, it will start to show dividends.
Yeah, they've started doing that on the computer side with these are required fields.
Yeah,
you must give an answer, and here are your choices.
So when I worked at CNA, I heard about this. It was a lecture to newbies on what to do when a study goes tango uniform, because this study was just a shit show from beginning to end, and it was a study for the Marines. And part of the problem was the data collection. It was about vehicle maintenance, and they found trucks where the odometers were running backwards.
Mm.
They found trucks where the serial number had been written in as the odometer reading. They found, and vice versa. And so basically, I don't want to make it sound like Marines are slackers, because they're not. But Marines also have this sense of what's important and what isn't. And if you tell them, no, really, this is important, we're going to track this and we're going to make decisions based upon this information, they will be meticulous. But if you don't tell them that, none of this surprised us. It's like, yeah, okay, nobody told them it was important, and so they assumed it wasn't, and they didn't care. They didn't care enough to do it right. If they care enough to do it right, if you tell them it's important that they do it right, they will do it right.
Yeah.
But they don't always do it right if they don't. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I hammer home that you use a part, let me know. And if I'm going to do the research, or somebody else is going to do the research, we're going to get into the parts database and the repair database to the best of our ability. And we're going to capture all that research we had to do. We're not just going to say, oh, I found this part, I ordered it, and nobody else will be able to find it again. So,
yeah.
Some of the ship systems, some of the databases on different ships, some ships are more open to tweaking and to being in control on the ship,
okay,
versus having to be controlled by a very centralized shoreside group.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah. So the upside of having it open on the ship is when they come up with something, they can add it. The downside is all too often they add it badly.
Yeah.
All these spare parts. Who's the manufacturer? Oh, General. It's a actual blank entry. You have to have an entry, so we created a fake one for you to use temporarily. And then they decided that they'd lock it down and you can't fix it.
There's if you go to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, it would be a long walk from my apartment, but it's walkable. They've got a B-17 display there, and they've got a turret that's pulled out of the B-17, and you can see it. I mean, it's like the entire turret assembly, not just the part on top, but like the barrel underneath it. And on the side, they're stenciled onto it. It says parts for this thing were made by two different companies, and they had two different part numbers, but they're interchangeable. And so if you're ordering a part, use both part numbers. because you don't know which one they're going to send you. So you need to ask for both, and they will find one of them and send them to you to fix it.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that was very interesting. And, clearly they didn't tell the two different companies, look, you have to adopt a common part system. They let them run it themselves, but then they stenciled the part number on it. They said it's either such and such by this company or such and such by this company.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of a nifty little thing to do that.
Yeah. One of the things I teach my people is if we get the wrong part in, because that's the part number in the manual that we have on board, we leave enough parts in the stock system to do the bare bones minimum of the job. And we put a note in there. This part doesn't fit. You are actually looking for this part now. And then they go and look for that. Oh, there it is. And
okay.
We also don't note it as, don't throw these away, even though they don't fit anything on this ship. There's a oil filter. The metal housing is, quote, the filter. It's labeled as a filter. It's like $900.
The
I
filter
don't know.
is like what, 20?
Yes. I don't know how many times I've seen people order a dozen of the filters when they really need is the element. And you start pawing through a ship that's been around for a while, and you find these things and you go, I know what this is. And if I don't teach everybody about this particular item, I know somebody's going to look in the database, order the wrong thing out of ignorance, and they'll keep doing it because they're not there when it comes in. So they don't know it's the problem. And they don't notice, they don't go to the stock system and find it and go and find that little note that, oh, that's what this is. So it's one of those, yeah, no, don't order this. You want this item instead.
Yeah, and everybody's overworked, and so they're doing it as fast as they can, and so they miss stuff.
Yeah, they don't want to do the feedback needed to, make it easier for the next guy sometimes.
So there's a very interesting cultural thing that you just touched on there. And that is U.S. weapon systems are designed for Westerners. And what that means is that there's certain assumptions built into the system. And I was told the story about the F-14s that were sold to the Iranians back in the day, some of which are still flying. Those F-14s, there was one particular computer chip that had a tendency to go bad. And the spare parts, and especially it went bad if it was exposed to like humidity or dust or whatever like that. You wanted to keep it clean in its wrapping. It came in a bag of like 4 or 5 of them. And if you took one out and then properly sealed the bag afterwards, took a little effort, you'd be fine. But frequently people wouldn't do that. And so there was this tendency that as a result of that, humidity would get in and the chip would malfunction. And so if you want to make sure you get a good chip, you just open the new bag. And so as a result of this, they were going through these parts at a relatively expensive part at 4 times the rate that they were in the US Navy, because everybody just opened a separate bag. And it was because apparently the culture, and I'm basing all this based upon this story I was told. This was given to me as I am not an expert in Iran by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm told that the issue is that there wasn't a premium put on sealing the bag. There wasn't a premium put, because that's effort that you do that you don't benefit from.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was an issue. And it's like nobody on the US side thought about that. It's like, well, just seal the bag, right? So that and the other guy will do it for you too. And it's like, yeah, that's not how this works here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the training thing. We get new guys on the ship, new guys in the industry. And that's one of those things, you might have to come back and 5 years later, you may actually benefit from this. So guess what? Make it easier for the next guy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just, so, okay. So let's talk about Star Trek in this regard for a moment. And this actually sort of goes to a topic that I want to do at some point, which is post-scarcity and how replicators work and that sort of stuff. It seems to me, it's like, okay, I'm on board my starship. I've got a replicator of some sort. I'm not going to be replicating warp coils, if for no other reason than the holy text. In the holy text, Rick Sternbach, blessed be his name, says that you can't replicate warp coils. You have to actually forge them, or cast them. I think he used the word cast. So, okay, but for smaller stuff, you should be able to replicate stuff. And we've got some reason to believe, and I'm going to double down on this argument when I do that other talk. We got some reason to believe that it's way, way, way more energy efficient to replicate something if you're starting with replicators are mostly about manipulating matter as opposed to creating matter. And if you start with something that's close to what you got, then it's easier to get to what you actually want, right? So it's hard to turn titanium into a turkey sandwich. It's easy to turn carbon sludge into a turkey sandwich.
Yeah.
So presumably this works with replicated parts also. And so it seems to me that a lot of times in Starfleet, what you're probably doing is taking a part out, putting it in the replicator, and using it as the feedstock to replicate its replacement.
Probably with a little bit of call from other, from the stash of basic materials.
Yeah. So, okay, it got pretty badly scorched. And so some of the copper that was in it is no longer in it because it got vaporized. So we got to add a little copper to sort of make it work out. But it seems like it's way easier to sort of start with the part and just fix it that way. We almost kind of see that happen in one or two episodes where they use the transporter to do some magical medical thing. I remember at least one instance where they fix people by having the transporter not transport the disease along with the people.
Yeah, there's sort of a biofilter they talked about, at least in one episode, I think.
Yeah, and as a general rule, I have to say, I hate replicators and I hate transporters. Not because I don't think they're really cool. It's because I think that for storytelling purposes, they are they're just way overpowered and
underused.
They're both very susceptible to abuse and not abused nearly as much as they should be.
Yeah. Why didn't you use the replicator or the transporter to solve this problem?
Exactly. It's like you mean you didn't think of this 400 episodes ago? It's pretty obvious. You can do that? Why didn't you do that before?
Yeah.
Yeah, the holodeck, Dustin points out the holodeck is way overpowered also. It's like if you can do the holodeck, why isn't the entire ship one giant holodeck? I mean, if you can use it to manipulate everything, etc., why isn't it one giant holodeck? I don't.
Yeah.
So I can press the I believe button and I can move forward on that, but it does seem like it's way overpowered.
Yeah.
So let me go back, so first of all, before I forget, We actually had everybody out there. We actually had a set of notes, and we haven't talked about anything on our set of notes.
Yeah.
So I think the right answer, Peter, if you're available, is why don't you come back and we'll do the set of notes some other time.
Okay then. Yeah.
Maybe in a couple of weeks. But let me go back and take a look real quick and see if there's anything worth jumping out at. Stephen Ross says, as opposed to needing a part and finding out the manufacturer went out of business before you were born.
Well, for me, not so much anymore. A lot of our new hires that are right out of college, that's all too true.
Well, and sometimes you throw away an otherwise perfectly good ship or perfectly good airplane because it's too hard to get parts. I know B-1 bombers have a higher cost per flight hour than I believe the F-35 does. And it's entirely because there's only a handful of them, and every part that they need is made for that specific airplane right now. They're ordering parts as in, we need an umpty frats, make us an umpty frats. Because sometimes I'm sure they're probably going out to the boneyard, because there are some in the boneyard, but it's really, really expensive when you can't just go to the warehouse. Even if you're going to the boneyard, you still have to submit a request. Hey, we need somebody to go out to such and such an airplane and pull this part off. That's non-trivial.
Yeah, one of the jobs I had before was dealing with consumables and hazmat, and trying to reuse the stuff was very expensive. It was generally cheaper to dispose of it as hazmat than to hire a hazmat qualified trucking company to move it 3 miles to go to another ship.
Yeah,
or maybe it was that you could buy it brand new cheaper. So it's just, we tried. We actually did fairly good on some stuff.
I've made the observation that I think that 90% of the world's problems can be attributed to a marketing department somewhere. And 9/10 of the remaining problems can be attributed to an accounting department somewhere. Now, I'm pretty sure that the ratios are off, but I'm also pretty sure that 99% of the world's problems can be attributed to either an accounting department or a marketing department somewhere. Yeah. And maybe this fits in that category, maybe it doesn't, but it just drives me crazy when I hear things like it's cheaper to dispose and buy new than it is to move it a dozen miles, or however long it is. Because you're talking about moving it to another ship in the same port.
Yeah.
So,
and then you also have to convince them to make the effort to come down, because if we don't have transportation and they do, or if they don't either, now it becomes you got to hire an outside person to deal with something. I mean, we got rid of some very expensive stuff to other ships, but there was an awful lot of stuff that was individually low value. But what are you going to do with it? We don't have time to go putting it in a car, because that's not legal, and driving it to another ship someplace, even in the same city.
Yeah, I'm not even dealing with hazmat, and I'm going to be spending, doing the typical move thing. Is it easier for me to move this, or is it easier for me to throw it away and then buy a new one when I get there?
Yeah.
Like I've got hand soap dispensers. This is what I was thinking about this morning. I've got these hand soap dispensers. So one of them is empty. Do I throw it away or do I refill it?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is if I refill enough of them before I move, I can move those and I can throw away the big bottle that the stuff comes in. But it's not immediately clear to me that that's the right answer.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have a replicator because then I can just sort of throw all this stuff in the replicator bin and it converts it into feedstock and just keeps it around for when it needs to replicate some plastic. Here's some plastic. Yeah. And plastic is actually close enough to turkey sandwich that I can probably, it's all carbon, right? It's close enough to turkey sandwich that I could turn the plastic into turkey sandwiches if I wanted to.
That would be an interesting little story of, you invent the transmitter, the replicator system from feedstock. They start mining all the old garbage dumps.
Yeah, in fact, I've always wanted to have the story where that was one of the things they do, where all of a sudden the garbage dumps become very, very useful. You see some interesting technologies, some of which was real world. Will McCarthy, science fiction author, ended up working as the technical advisor or the chief technology officer for a company doing artificial atoms. And so the idea behind this artificial atoms thing is that you've got basically a series of things that act like they're electrons. And so because you can sort of change the number of fake electrons, you can use it to do chemistry. It's basically, think universal catalyst. Yeah. So you can facilitate chemical reactions in a wide variety of things. John Barnes used it in his Duke of Uranium series, where in the episode where they ended up on Mercury, they've got these like basically magma flows. And they've got these plates that they set it for whatever thing that they want to gather out of the magma, and the plates get stuck into the magma, and they sort of come out with having attracted whatever mineral it is that they're trying to get on that particular time. And it can be oxygen also. It's not limited to metals. And they basically they've got a series of these plates, and they set them up to get stuff, and then eventually what's left at the end, it's not worth processing anymore. They just sort of dump off in a slag heap somewhere. Those books were an interesting set of books. And the problem I think that he ran into with them is they started off really reading like Heinlein young adults. And then in like the second book, I think it was the second of the three books, it went from being a Heinlein young adult to being really, really dark and somewhat perverted.
Modern young adult.
It did not track as young adult at that point at all.
No, this is about how young adult has changed.
I don't even know if that's the case.
No, okay.
In this particular case, it's just like, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
But I don't know. We were talking about Hunger Games with Lissa before Lissa's waving to me, before the show started. And I think she was commenting that she had actually read them. I haven't read any of them either. So I haven't read modern young adult in a while.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute since I got a hold of any YA, but given the prescient times, it felt fitting to pick it up.
Yeah, I think Hunger Games is YA.
It is. That's why I said I haven't picked up YA in a while. Though yeah. Hunger Games is one of those ones that the content is more on the adult side of YA versus younger side. So, be aware. If you are going to let your kids read this book, it's a good book from my understanding, but, know the themes that are there, and there are certain times that might be more appropriate to introduce them to kids.
Yeah.
YA is not quite, it overlaps with, but is not the old juvenile category.
Yeah. Like YA typically is more on the edgier side of things, Like, it's YA tends to tackle subjects that are more emotionally in-depth. And
Yes.
that can be triggering for some people if they don't have an idea of what's about to happen in the book.
Yeah.
So I'm scrolling back down through the chat log, and Stephen Ross says, I remember in one building they had a temporary furnace in a hallway while a machinist made a part for the actual furnace.
That's, I guess, one way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just the entire concept of temporary furnace, but I guess if you were close to whatever, I don't know if it's pumping out hot air or hot water, but I suppose you could just sort of connect it into the
Yeah, I was
system.
going to say, it depends on what kind of furnace we're talking about, because there's a couple different types of furnace that could be doing a couple different things.
Yeah.
I'm just
Like, if it's a heat furnace, yeah, no, that makes sense. A boiler furnace, I would be concerned. Context matters here.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of discussion about Starfleet ship fleet junkyards and stuff like that. And I've actually done a little bit of thinking about what that process looks like in sort of like, how do you mothball ships in Star Trek or something like that? I could see Star Trek or something. One of the things that I always thought has been sort of wrong about Star Trek is I don't think the computers are nearly as powerful as they should be. I don't understand why every ship doesn't have its own AI, for instance. Rami in Andromeda makes a lot more sense.
Because the real world implications of it too. So with AI, it takes a lot of actual data space and energy. So that could actually stress a ship's computer capabilities, depending on like the actual like.
So kiloquads and subspace warp core, and I've got all sorts of
I know
things.
there's a lot of like, obviously we're already suspending disbelief about power supply issues, things going on, but like if we were gonna actually give it a real world reason why that's the case, that's
Well,
what I would say.
you've got Mr. Data, and you've always had the computer speaking.
You've always had the computer speaking, but in terms of like the AI using power compared to a warp drive, the power of the AI is like rounding error compared to the
warp. No, you're not wrong. Again, like we're already suspending disbelief when it comes to the power consumption use.
But I could easily see a situation where sort of like the way it would work is a ship comes back from, 5-year journey, whatever it is, and they do a bunch of work to the hull and repair a bunch of systems, but they don't necessarily do all the upgrades at that point. And the ship sort of hangs around in orbit for a while, and it's just sort of in the mothball fleet for a while, and then they upgrade it and send it back out. Although one of the things that really sort of differentiates Starfleet from any terrestrial experience is the Federation is expanding at some rate, maybe not the way in Jean-Luc's era that it did in Kirk's era, but it's still expanding. The borders are moving out. And so I don't see Starfleet getting any smaller over time. I see it.
If anything, it's going to get bigger just based on their diplomatic relations that they're building. Even if you're not talking about more people joining the Federation itself, like just talking about the diplomatic relations and the soft power that comes from those diplomatic relations and assisting with situations.
Yeah. But as these things, as it expands, it seems to me that in the Star Trek universe, and I've made this comment before.
Furnace. Okay, we're less concerned now.
Okay. Yeah. It seems to me that from the on the Star Trek side of things, replicators, etc., those ships can hang around for a long time. In my own sort of working headcanon hypothesis about the decision on getting rid of ships is that as long as you can upgrade them to do something useful, you probably will. You stop doing that when the ship just is so inherently limited by the size of the ship or the size of the warp core or something like that, that you can't really go any further with it. And ships slowly over time get less and less important jobs. So, Mirandas used to be frontline ships. They stopped being frontline ships at some point. Excelsiors used to be frontline ships. They stopped being frontline ships at some point. But there's plenty of stuff that you can do.
One of the things I remember explicitly from Enterprise was the way they would, as you just said, do that kind of step down, but they wouldn't just do that step down in the, for lack of a better term, military aspect. They would take those Federation ships and then pass them down to merchants. Because if I remember correctly, their pilot in Enterprise, his family ship was one that had originally been a step down.
Which is an interesting idea, because that's one of those things that in the real world just doesn't work. Because the optimization of the design for a warship, like a U.S. Navy ship versus a merchant ship, is so totally different. The closest you can get, U.S. Navy shipbuilding standards are dramatically different than like civilian shipbuilding standards. You go to other countries, and the Navy standards are a lot closer to the civilian shipbuilding standards. In some cases, because they build warships like civilian ships, Japan, or in other cases, because they build civilian ships like warships, China. And you sort of end up at approximately the same location doing it that way from both sides.
Well, and I think that is, I would say the Federation is more in line with the way Japan does it, just simply because of the fact that the Federation, their ships are explicitly for exploration.
But you run into the situations like, why do you have merchant ships? And the answer is to carry cargo efficiently. And the carrying cargo part is important, and the efficiently part is important. And if you can't do that, and you couldn't take an Arleigh Burke destroyer and turn it into a meaningful freighter of any sort whatsoever, right? There is nothing about that ship that would make it useful as a freighter. Not even it would have a limited cargo capacity, and even if that's all the cargo capacity you want, it's still the wrong ship, because it's going to be way too expensive to operate.
Well, and I also think another aspect we're forgetting about is essentially the public transportation aspect of it, because those ships can potentially now be used as civilian ships to get people places instead, depending on what type of ship it is.
And a Starfleet ship probably makes a better passenger liner than a U.S. Navy ship would. Because a U.S. Navy ship would make a shitty passenger.
Yeah.
And obviously, again, it depends on what type of ship we're talking about, because I would not want to ride in crap, I can't think of the name of the ship. The one in Deep Space Nine.
Defiant?
I would not want to be a passenger on the Defiant, for example. That is just strictly made for like being a military vessel.
I love Stephen Ross's comment that I just threw up on the screen. Why, yes, our tramp merchantman used to be a Battlestar.
Yes, exactly.
That
No,
actually might work.
I wouldn't want to ride in the Defiant, but like if the Enterprise E, for example, ever got stepped down to that level, that would be a perfect passenger liner. That's pretty much what it was made for originally. You're a passenger liner that's for exploration purposes. Yeah,
I mean it's a town in space. It's a space-going space colony. Battlestars actually, with those big flight pods, actually have a metric shit ton of storage capacity. I'm not sure that they would be efficient run that way, but they basically, the Galactica spent the entire Cylon War with one of its pods inoperable because it was using it as a refugee facility, which is really kind of interesting. In the Exordium series, which at some point we are going to do a read through, but I've promised myself that I'm not going to do the read through until I finish the game that I owe Chris Carlson and Larry Bond, which is, this move is not going to make that any easier, at least in the short term. In the Exordium series, the Rifters, which are sort of the outside society group that some of them just live outside of the civilized society. Others are actively pirates. The ones that are actively pirates got their destroyers because there had been a time period several hundred years earlier where the Panarchic Navy had basically changed destroyer classes. And they sold off their old destroyers to be used as merchantmen because the destroyers each had a skip missile tube, and the skip missile tube was a kilometer long. And it made an acceptable cargo hold. It was a really weirdly shaped cargo hold, but it made an acceptable cargo hold. And so they stripped out the skip missile from it. And so now you've got this long compartment that's basically a kilometer long that you could use as your cargo hold. And some of those Rifter destroyers were destroyers for like 150 years, or they were cargo ships for like 150 years until they got bought up by the Rifters, who then turned them back into destroyers. Which is a really sort of interesting little background bit in that book, and I'll get into the details of that when I actually do the read through with everybody.
Yeah, I think that's one of those differences that we went from Age of Sail, when you could take a warship design, strip the cannons off, and turn it into a cargo ship almost relatively easily, to yeah, no, you've got too many specialized pieces of equipment to do that on a steel ship. Well, all the barbettes, all the guns, okay, you get rid of, remove the whole guns and rework everything. It's like, yeah, you're better off just building from scratch.
Well, there's that, and something to keep in mind is like modularity of ships. Because the focus is now on specialization versus here's a design that we can now just like add 1,000 things to personalize for the situation.
Yeah, you see that in the in Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Liaden series, where at some point House Liad had to go to war, so they went to the warehouse and pulled out all the weapons pods and put them on their merchant ships.
Yeah.
And originally you had if you go back to the age of galleys, you had dedicated merchant ships and dedicated warships, and they were different types of ships. In the Age of Sail, you ended up with merchant ships, and you turned a merchant ship into a warship just by adding some guns, and that lasted for a while, but eventually you concluded, no, I want a dedicated warship, and navies became a thing in the way that they weren't before. It used to be that navies were just sort of like the king would give a warrant and say, okay, you're now the Navy, and so go do Navy things, and eventually they concluded that doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
And so you had weird holdovers like the British East Indiamen that were designed to be combination warships and freighters. I think the only reason why East Indiamen really worked is that there wasn't big ships for them to fight against in the area. When a British East Indiaman against a French warship, you'd rather have the French warship. But against the locals, the Indians weren't really going to put up much to fight against a British East Indiaman. So, okay, let me do one quick little look through here and see if there's anything else, because we are at the hour and 15-minute mark. Like I said, we got a page of notes. We didn't even touch on any of them. So we need to talk about, how the shipping industry has changed, and one of the things we were going to talk about is choke points and how choke points affect things, and sort of talk about that in a science fiction context, and we didn't do any of that. So I'm looking forward to you coming back, Peter, and we can have that conversation. Okay, furnaces. Logic's Finest points out that writers play fast and loose. Yes, they do.
Yeah, that's kind of just the point of science fiction and fantasy in general, though, because fast and loose, you're playing with these concepts of us either having tech or something else that makes us more advanced in some way.
I would go one step further. I'd say the point of the show is because writers and media creators play fast and loose. And it's not that I'm saying by any stretch of the imagination that these people, you shouldn't enjoy this because they're playing fast and loose. It's more along the lines of, let me show you how they're playing fast and loose, because I think there's some interesting things in there. So let's talk about how it translates and how it doesn't. And, this thing is just, Nathan Lowell does a great job of taking the modern merchant marine, filing the serial numbers off, adding in space onto the end, and it works.
Yeah.
In space.
Doesn't always work when you take something and file the serial numbers off and slap in space on the end.
Wait, I think we have a button for this. Space.
That is a good button. So let's see. Okay, I'm scrolling back, and I think I'm back to stuff we've already looked at. So I think we're good. Okay, so with that in mind, I think it's time to call it a night. And I would like to say what I always say. Well, actually, first of all, I didn't show off my shirt. So that's what my shirt says. So second of all, I'd like to say, as always, I am honored that you're spending your Saturday night listening to me and Lissa and Peter talk about science fiction merchant marines and all the stuff that goes along with it. I'm always amazed that people are willing to come and listen to me talk. And as long as you're willing to come and listen to me talk, I'll continue doing it. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you not next week, not the week after, or no, not next week, but the week after. Peter, are you available?
We have a button for this.
Yeah, we have a button. Peter, are you available on the 19th of April?
Let me check. One sec. I got to see when Passover is. Yes, I should be.
Okay. All right, then. So let's just plan on doing Merchant Marine Round 2 on the 19th of April. And I probably won't. In fact, I know I won't have any insight on what May and June look like at that point, but I'll figure it out as soon as I can. I'll let everybody know. But in the meantime, everybody, I'd like to say thank you very much and have a good week. See you next time.
Live long and prosper, guys.
Woohoo!
Actually,
Ooh.